Everybody ready? Good. Then let's get going. Oh, nearly forgot you guys. Hey everyone, a really warm welcome back. This video is the next part in our series about towing and carrying bikes with us on our caravanning adventures. And in this episode I want to talk about the Atera Strata DL rack. That goes on the hitch on the back of the car. So let's get into the video. So before we get into talking about the model itself, just a little bit of context here. Some Ariba touring owners, so the tourings being those lovely looking retro ones, quite often silver or silver and white. Anyway, Ariba touring owners manage to get a tow ball mounted quite often onto their A-frame, and then they can use a ball mounted rack there whilst they're towing, and then they can transfer it across to the car once they're pitched up. So that's rather handy. And we needed a 4-bike rack for the car anyway, for just normal days out. But I had that Ariba touring idea at the back of my mind when I was deciding what rack to buy. You know, the sort of idea, one rack to rule them all. So as well as that Ariba touring specific option, I also had this more Alco chassis compatible solution in mind. So this one you just clamp on to the chassis itself, because the gas locker on our Ariba Feeling is much more like a conventional one, so where it's hinged at the top and raises up, than the one found on the Ariba Touring. So I had these ideas in mind, and ideally we would have had just one rack that could go on a ball mounted onto the chassis itself when we were towing, and then transfer the rack onto the back of the car when we got to wherever we wanted to go, if the rides we wanted to do were not directly from the site. Because of course, back when I was thinking about this, the boys were quite small, so they weren't particularly good on the roads, and so we were looking for very much old disused railway lines or little paths that we could ride along safely, rather than trying to do cross country on busy roads. Anyway, when the Strata DL rack turned up, it was very clear at that point that the dream of one rack to rule them all just wasn't going to happen. It was quite difficult to find the specifications for exact sizes online at the time, although I think they're much more accessible these days. And it wasn't possible to have just this one rack because our A-frame just wasn't long enough. Hence, we had to go for the Fiamma A-frame rack and then keep this one for just the days out with the car. And I'll link to the review and the assembly and so on that I did for the Fiamma rack up above. So let me talk you through how this all fits together, how it fits onto the tow ball and how it all works. So it comes ready assembled as a 3-bike rack, and then you just add the 4th rail, which I'll show you a bit later on. And mounting it onto the car is pretty simple really. Just pick it up, one hand on the locking handle itself and one hand on the frame itself to get good support across the whole rack. Just pull the handle towards you slightly and that opens the jaws of the hitch itself. Pop it onto the ball. There is a lower U-shaped bit of metal which actually rests on the stem of the hitch, and that stops it from tilting any further forwards or backwards. And then push the handle back to sit it onto the ball completely. Then you pull up the back part and then clamp it into place. It's probably easier in terms of handling to do it this way round, so with the back part folded down to start with and then push it up. But either way is possible, it just depends how you prefer to handle the rack. Probably depends on your height and what works best for you. Anyway, here's a close-up of the whole operation. Then the last step is to push down on the locking handle and get that into the lock position. It's exactly the same sort of thing that you would do as if you were clamping an Alco stabilizer handle into place, for example, except in this case you can hear the click 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 as the ratchet secures into place. So here again is a close-up, and notice those clicks as the ratchet goes down into the lock position. And then it's basically the same procedure in reverse to take the rack off. So squeeze the trigger on the locking handle to release the ratchet, push the handle up to loosen those clamps. So then, depending on whether it works for you, this method certainly does for me, to fold down the back bit and then to tidy up the cables and so on, ready to lift the whole rack off. Then you pull the locking handle again. This time it opens up the jaws, and then you can lift the whole thing off. Sometimes it's not perfectly ready, perhaps the ratchet hasn't entirely released the first time around, so just push the handle back down to get that to release, and then back forward again, and that releases the jaws and you'll be ready to lift off. So as before, this can also be done with the back part upwards. Although, as I said, I do find carrying the rack around like this rather awkward. And for me, life is much easier with that back bit folded down. It might be a height thing, or it might just work for everybody like that. So that's certainly my recommendation. Here again is a close-up of the whole procedure, so you can see what's happening, and you can see what the jaws are up to. So now notice how when the clamp handle is in the vertical position, the whole rack can rotate around the ball quite smoothly. It can go from left to right. It can't go up and down though because of that piece of U-shaped metal that I was talking about earlier. So the bit that's resting on the stem of the ball itself. But it can rotate freely left and right. Although very clearly in the same sort of way you get on a normal caravan hitch, the green pin shows that it is properly hitched up. So same sort of idea in operation as a stabilizer hitch. Clever, hey? Okay, so let's talk about functionality. As I said, you get the same sort of correctly hitched red-green indicator as you do on a normal Alco hitch. And there's a black A-frame type subframe under here actually. It's this arrangement with the silver-coloured aluminium trays for the bikes that are sitting on the top that give it the, I guess, the robust feel and the stability. The stabilizer handle locks, which locks the whole frame to the vehicle. And then each of the bikes get their own top bar and plastic wheel receiver for each wheel. Each of the arms that attach to the top tube or one of the higher tubes of the bike has a very strong ratchet buckle on it, which also locks. So the bikes are locked to the frame and then the frame is locked to the vehicle. You know, despite that, I'm sure it's not a good idea to leave bikes unattended for a long time. Certainly not expensive ones, because I'm sure any determined and well-equipped thief wouldn't have too much of an issue here. You know, why can't they put all those skills and effort into doing something useful? I don't know. But anyway, it should stop any opportunistic thefts. The rail for the fourth bike is an add-on, so that's bought separately, and then it bolts on through the main rack, and then the locking arm for that one actually is totally separate, so it locks the third and the fourth bikes together, and of course it locks at both ends of that, so that the fourth bike is secured to the rack as well as the rack to the car and so on. And I have to say I'm pretty impressed by the clamps. They're probably the chunkiest, best padded, and I think the most easily lockable and securable ones I've seen so far. And these are the tyre receivers. The rubber strap ratchets in and tightens as soon as you push it in. And it's a very positive click that you hear, and you know, this whole thing is quite robust. It certainly feels nice and robust. So you actually have to press the release buttons to get the thing to unlock. And unlike Fiamma rails, which just rely on friction fit for each of these wheel receivers, these ones actually slide fairly easily up and down the rail itself, depending on the size of your bike and where your wheels are positioned. And then once you've got it into the correct position, you clamp it into place. And this clamp feels really strong actually. Personally, I much prefer this approach. So it's a nice, smooth, easy sliding action, and then a really positive position, and they're not going to slide out of place there. So it just helps to keep everything a lot tighter and stop things wobbling and moving around. Again, lovely and chunky. It just feels well engineered. You know, it's a pleasure to use rather than a bit of a fight. So here's how the fourth bike rail is secured. It clamps over the third rail tray. So you wouldn't be able to put, you know, a tiny little bike on tray 3 with this added extra in place, because it bolts in through the main frame itself. And then the fourth rail sits higher than the rest of the others, and it sits above the rear lights on the number plate. Here's the youngest and I fitting it. And you can have a bird's eye view. We'll clamp you on the back of the Volvo. And back in the day when the weeds didn't seem to grow through the driveway faster than I could keep up with them, which seems to be happening at the moment. So finally, let me show you how this thing slides away from the car so you can still get access to the boot even when all the bikes are in place. There's a little green release button on the right side of the carrier which you press, and when you hear the clunk, you know it's unlocked. So then you press down on the handle which is directly below the number plate, and that's a long handle, so it's easy to hold and easy to push down. And you hear another clunk, and that's released the secondary clamping for the frame itself. And then the whole thing slides backwards, the whole aluminium section comes down, leaving the black A-frame chassis bit still attached to the car. So some of these styles of racks have sliding mechanisms like this one, and others have ones where you tilt the thing backwards. And personally, I much prefer the sliding mechanism over the tilting ones, because for the sliding ones, the rack itself is still supporting most of the weight of the bikes. Whereas if you tilt 4 bikes towards you, actually you're taking an awful lot of that weight yourself. So potentially, I guess it's like bench pressing, I don't know, 45, 50, 60 kilos even. And you can see what I mean by the sort of chassis here. There's this super strong black box section bit, and then the lighter weight aluminium bits for the rails themselves, which lock into place onto this black box section bit. And here we are from another angle. So super easy, slides down, push up, and click, locks everything into place. Nice and easy to use and very secure, so that gives you a nice comforting feeling that nothing's going anywhere. Okay, so that's it in terms of how it works. And as a reminder, I should say this channel is far too small at the moment, well, at least at the time I'm recording this, for any of this to be sponsored or to be anything other than paid full price, just like anyone else would do. I'm just interested in sharing with you the thought process that went into why this one and showing how it works. So let's talk about plus sides. On the plus side, this thing is super convenient. In use, it's at a good height, so it's easy to load, especially for shorties like me. And I really like the way it's engineered. Everything feels very positive, very well thought out, and it just clicks together and holds everything. I don't have to worry about extra straps or any of the rest of it. I feel quite confident in the security of the bikes on the back of the vehicle. Now, the downside, although this thing claims to be super lightweight and stable, it's still over 15 kilograms with a 4th bike rail in place, which is still a pig to handle. But I guess you need that for the stability, and boy, it really is stable. Once this thing is click closed, this thing doesn't even shift a millimeter. So, that stability is a huge plus point, as well as the ease of use, but its sheer bulk might be a bit of an issue for some. So, for example, we've got a couple of forest trails about 30 minutes or so drive away, but the car park is properly laid out, it's measured out for normal car sizes. So in most of the spaces, you can't actually leave the rack attached to the car. They'll just be sticking out in the roadway or just getting in people's way while you head off for a ride. So the racks have to come off if they're of this style once you're parked up. And this thing has a footprint of something like 100 centimeters wide by almost a meter deep by the time you've got the 4th rail in place. And that will just not go across the boot of our XC60, which is a real pain. In theory it goes. I think, we've ended up as something like a centimetre or slightly less than that, just too small. And because of the shape of the boot coming up, we can't even put it in diagonally, really. So if we do need to get the rack off the back of the car and inside the car itself, we had to fold down the back seats. Now, that's okay now the boys are out of car seats and they're big enough, that's fairly easy. But when they were in car seats, it was an absolute pain in the neck, obviously. So if we didn't get one of those premium parking spots where we didn't have to take the rack off, it was a real pain. I think when that happened one day, we ended up taking the rack off and just using one of the bike locks to lock it onto the tow hitch itself, so it wasn't going to go anywhere. There's no way it was going in the car with the car seats in there. So please check and double check all your measurements if you're thinking of something like this, and think about the places you ride and whether you'd have to take it off the car when you do so. I like your log carrying. Alright, so that's all there is to say for today. Thanks so much for watching. We hope it was useful going through not just the features of this particular rack itself, but also the sort of things that we looked for when we were looking for a rack, and so that might help others who are thinking about the same sort of ideas. Anyway, thanks for watching, and bye for now. See ya.